He was here as a professor until 1922 when he became emeritus. He did not publish very much, but he liked to travel to Europe and went back to Europe almost every year and maintained a lot of his friendships with the people that he'd known in psychology. One of them, of course, was David Starr Jordan's. And so Angell had, I guess, a perfectly reasonable life. Does the name mean anything to you here at Stanford? Sure. What does it mean? It's the track, the running track, named for him. You know, he was an early Wundtian and therefore knew about equipment, and he knew about stopwatches. So he was the big boy on timing the races and loved doing that and did it well enough that they named the field after him. He taught pretty much, in general, only one course in psychology. Then he taught courses in philosophy. And he had one assistant that was not talked of much around here, and I find her fascinating. Jack Hilgard became fascinated with her. Her name was Lillian Jane Martin. And she was a spunky young woman who had decided she wanted to go to college, had written the president of Cornell that she had saved up enough money to pay for her room and board, and would the college give her a scholarship for her tuition? No. So she got herself to Vassar, where they were apparently more welcoming, finished at Vassar, then took herself to Europe and worked with G.E. Muller, who was an early Wundtian type, and a guy with the best name that any psychologist ever had, Oswald Kilpe, who was, they were both very well-established psychologists in Germany. Lillian Jane Martin came out here. I'm not quite sure what the connection was. I think somebody she knew at Vassar was the sister of David Starr Jordan, and I think that's the way things worked in those days, and they suggested, well, you should go to Stanford. And she worked as, I suppose, an assistant. I don't see any title like assistant professor, although she did have a PhD. And she worked for Frank Angell, running the laboratory. One publication that I have looked at, but not read carefully, which in 1906 described the psychology laboratory, which was, by that time, in what you would call math corner, which to them was physics corner, on that northeast corner of the quad. And psychology was given the upper floor over on top of physics, interestingly enough. One more thing about Lillian Jane Martin is that she retired finally at Stanford, moved into San Francisco, and was very active in establishing courses and programs for retired women. Now, I thought that was kind of interesting to be doing in 1920. Angell is probably famous not only because they named the running track after him, but that he had a cousin named James Roland Angell, who became the president of Yale. One of the things that Angell did of interest was he knew William James, and he convinced William James to come and be a visiting professor at Stanford. You can see the letters sort of serving as a contractual form, and James's one demand is that he not be asked to teach more than one class at a time during a quarter that had 75 students, more than 75 students in it. He came to Stanford, lived on Salvatierra in the upper half of a double house, and there were always double houses in there. And the first floor was our friend Lillian Jane Martin, who kind of took care of James and his wife. Well, James and his wife were here when, in 1906, something special happened. We had an earthquake for him. He found that very interesting, kind of exciting, and somewhat frightening, and I think his wife found it just frightening. They left in April, although James was here plenty long enough to give they had a Tuesday evening lecture series, and it's at that James gave the first version of The Moral Equivalent of War, which was his proposal to substitute athletic contests for war, which is as reasonable as any other proposal as I've heard on war. Now, Angell, with the assistance of Martin, in his long tenure, produced one PhD. A guy named John Edgar Coover, who got his PhD in 1912, and he kind of stayed on and hung around. He did research on formal discipline. Coover, as a new PhD, was appointed to the staff because he was going to write a volume on some of the research that he had done in psychical phenomena. Now, the brief story is that Stanford had a brother named Thomas Welton Stanford, who had become very interested in psychical phenomena, had moved to Australia, and through some means, maybe it was psychic research, became very rich. And he contacted his brother and said, I will give some money to Stanford if they do research on psychical phenomena. And Coover did a lot of this. Now, it was as kind of as straight as you could do it and still be doing that stuff. For example, he did a whole series of experiments on the question of being stared at. You recall the notion that some people have portrayed that if you're sitting down front and if a whole bunch of people in the back all stare at you, you will in time recognize that you're being stared at and look around or something of that sort. Being stared at was the phenomenon. Coover did a whole set of studies on that and said there's nothing to it. But he did them carefully enough that Thomas Welton Stanford finally said, okay, I will endow a program for research on psychical and other psychological events. And it was that the trustees used to try and get the money but get out of doing just apports. Now, there used to be in the Stanford Museum, this I'm totally dependent on Jack Hilgard here, a cabinet of apports. Would anyone care to say what an apport is?
They're in special collection.
Pardon?
They're still here. They're in special collection.
Well, I don't think they're seeable, though, are they, Peter? Yes, they are.
Objects from the other world, from the seances in Melbourne.
Yeah, they appear after a seance, do they not? And the medium is usually... But you could see them now? All right, then you can all go look at the apports. Do you have to go down to the basement or something of that sort? Okay. Somebody can do that. Well, the outcome of this was that the department received a grant of $526,000, and that was very big money in those days, and it essentially allowed the department to support somebody doing that sort of work, plus a lot of other activity in the department. It was a really great help to them because of that phrase of psychical and other psychological events. And the trustees were to monitor this, and I think the Stanford trustees finally said, well, we're not going to monitor it anymore. Other things is everything psychologists do. So the outcome of Frank Angell's time was, in a way, the establishment of psychology as a department in the university, although not with any special significance. Now, I hadn't realized this, but Lewis Terman came to Stanford in around 1910 as an assistant professor of education. And he was here just in education until 1922, when, as the story goes, he went to his campus mailbox and there was a note from the president saying, "You are hereby appointed chairman of psychology." Well, I mean, that was perfectly legitimate. Lewis Terman had a PhD in psychology from Clark, done under the direction of Clark's great god, G. Stanley Hall. You recall it was G. Stanley Hall who convinced Clark, who was some guy made a lot of money, and probably something mechanical in Worcester, Massachusetts, and G. Stanley Hall talked him into establishing this country's first graduate school. That's all. It would be just training graduate students. And G. Stanley Hall, being a psychologist, says, why don't we begin with psychology? And they got going okay, but then Mr. Donor kind of ran out of money. Terman was made chairman in 22. This was after he had really done the work on the Stanford Binet. He'd established the phrase IQ in everybody's vocabulary. He had a firmer belief than I do in the so-called constancy of the IQ. But he was a mighty effective department chairman. I will say that prior to becoming chairman, he had worked in World War I on the Army Alpha and the Army Beta tests. And these were the Army General Classification Test in its first form. And the Alpha was for people who could read and write, and the Beta was a non-verbal test. At least you didn't have to read and write. Given to a couple of million people. Okay, so Terman becomes the chairman of a department that doesn't really have anyone in it.